Canada's plan for a net zero power grid by 2030. The federal government announced today what that will look like and how it thinks provinces can achieve the target even if some think it is not feasible. David Thurton has been covering this all day. He's with me now. David, this was much watched. This was highly anticipated. Give us the details we have in the regulations the minister revealed today.
Well, what we saw in these regulations, Heather, is how the government is going to fulfill its big ambition to have a net zero electricity grid by the year 2035. That's the big target that the federal government has in mind as they roll out these regulations. And the thing that the government keeps emphasizing is that these regulations are very flexible. It's a sort of choose your own adventure when it comes to fulfilling the government's dream of having a net zero electricity grid. So obviously the federal government wants provinces and territories to use non-emitting sources of electricity, such as hydroelectricity, solar, wind, nuclear power. Those non-emitting sources is what the government wants provinces and territories to use. But of course, we have provinces such as Alberta and Saskatchewan and Ontario that rely on things such as natural gas. And this was a big concern. Would these regulations require these provinces to phase out this form of power generation? Well, we heard from the minister through these draft regulations that he's not phasing out natural gas. It will be allowed to be used in 2035, but under certain conditions. And those conditions require the use of carbon capture to suck out a huge portion of the emissions, 95% of the emissions. And there are some exceptions where you will be able to run gas plants without capturing the carbon from them, such as during emergencies, such as when the wind doesn't blow or the sun isn't shining, you aren't getting any power from those renewables, or if there's a sudden surge in demand. So on a hot day when people are blowing those air conditioners, or on a very cold day when people are cranking up the heat, Heather.
So a fair degree of flexibility then, David, to bring in some of those opposing provinces. What has been the initial reaction from those provinces?
Well, provinces like Saskatchewan and Alberta don't think that this regulation offers a whole lot of flexibility. First of all, they were opposed to this net zero target by 2035 for the electricity grid before we saw the regulations, and now that we've seen them, they remain opposed. I mean, we heard from Alberta's Environment Minister, Rebecca Schultz, today, and she said that, this is a regulation that has been developed not through, common sense, but through ideology. She also said that this is a bait and switch, where the government is saying you could run your natural gas plants, just use carbon capture. She says those sort of stringency requirements, Heather, would basically just phase out natural gas plants. They would be forced to close, essentially, is what she's saying. She also said that, we can't just have these natural gas plants on standby and take them out the cupboard when we need them. That's not how a big power plant works. There are idling costs that go with it. So Alberta's very concerned about those issues, especially about affordability. Here's a bit more from Alberta's Environment Minister.
The federal government setting an arbitrary target of 2035 for a net zero electricity grid is completely unrealistic. It's also unconstitutional. And of course, it impedes the affordability and reliability of our grid for everyday Albertans.
So, Heather, just let me emphasize, the federal government emphasizes that these are draft regulations. So although there are provinces that have some issues with them, there is time for them to work things out. The federal government says these are not set in stone yet.
Well, that's the matter of these next 75 days, this period of additional tweaking, as the minister refers to it, or consultation. What's going to happen in the near term, David?
Well, there's going to be lots of opportunity for discussion. I mean, certainly Alberta said in its comments today that the one bright spot in all of this is that these are draft regulations. Nothing is set in stone. So there will be an opportunity for the province to have its voice, have its say. And also there's a working table or working group that has been set up between Ottawa and Alberta to discuss both governments' emission reduction plans. So that potentially will be an avenue for both governments to iron things out. But if you look at, the legacy of federal climate policy, someone was reminding me, it often ends up with the government imposing its will on provinces, whether that's climate carbon pricing, whether that is the single-use plastics ban. The government imposes its policy against oftentimes the will of these provinces. They often end up taking the government to court saying that you're trampling on our jurisdiction. So this is where this could be heading if the government doesn't change tact here.
David, thank you so much for covering this all day. David Thurton with me in Ottawa, and some of the things David was just mentioning, you're going to hear more ahead, because the question now of how will the federal government respond to the criticism from the provinces to this net zero electricity plan. Joining me now, the Minister of Environment and Climate Change, Steven Guilbeault. Minister Guilbeault, welcome back to Power and Politics.
Thank you very much.
You emphasized today, as you made the announcement of your regulations, emphasized flexibility and you emphasized consultation. And yet the opposition to what you've announced today has been very forceful. We just received the reaction to this from Alberta and from Premier Danielle Smith, Minister Guilbeault, and I'd like to read some of what she has said in her statement. She calls your draft regulations unconstitutional, irresponsible, says they do not align with Alberta's emission reduction and energy development plan. She's looking, as you well know, at 2050, and then goes on to say they will not be implemented in our province, period, and reiterates the word unconstitutional. She said they will endanger the reliability of Alberta's grid and cause massive increases in Albertans' power bills. So why don't we start there? Could you respond to her concerns, please?
Well, first, what I'd like to say is that I've seen several comments coming from energy companies, including energy companies in Alberta, from workers across the country, from environmental organizations, from think tanks, who all are praising what the federal government has presented today. It would seem like the Alberta government hasn't read the regulations, because just a few days ago, Premier Smith was saying that the regulations would not allow Alberta to continue using gas post 2035, which is simply not true. If you take 5 minutes to read the regulations, we are allowing natural gas to be used under certain conditions in Canada post 2035. Premier Smith said that we would not allow natural gas to be used for peak energy demand. Again, that's simply not true. If you take the time to read the regulations, we are allowing natural gas to be used for peak demand. So those periods of time where we have, for example, in the middle of the winter and more in the summertime because of cooling, where we have very high electricity demand, we would allow natural gas to be used in those instances. So these are two statements that Premier Smith has made that are simply not true.
The use of the word unconstitutional, though, repeatedly through that statement, I don't know whether that signals to you Alberta's Sovereignty Act. And what if the province uses that legislation to say this does not apply?
I think we don't see eye to eye on some of these things with the government of Alberta, and it's unfortunate. They disagreed with carbon pricing, and that went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the federal government won. And the Supreme Court was very clear that the federal government, when it comes to climate change and climate pollution, has constitutional rights to intervene. And that's exactly what we're doing. We're not telling provinces how to develop their electricity production in the coming years. We're saying that from a pollution perspective, certain standards have to be met. We're giving provinces, utilities 12 years. The regulations I announced today will only come into force January 1st, 2035. So we're giving them a lot of time to prepare for that. And if Alberta chooses to challenge this in front of the court, obviously it's their right to do so. But based on the carbon pricing case, we feel we're on very solid constitutional ground to do what we're doing.
It's interesting, Minister, because a similar reaction has come from Saskatchewan in the statement from Premier Moe. He refers to constitutionally protected provincial responsibility, again contradicting what you've just said there. And he, too, similar to Alberta, says these net zero targets are simply not achievable in Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan's still working on that 2050 framework that you know well. So even though not enforceable until 2035, I'm wondering, will you allow provinces that have a longer way to go, more to do to green their grid, will you allow them more time without any sort of penalty?
No, obviously the regulations we're presenting today are so that provinces or energy utilities comply with the regulations 12 years from now in 2035. And of course, if you don't try to do something, you can't do it. And those who say it can't be done have no analysis whatsoever to prove it. We've proven today. We've tabled documents that show how it can be done. And there's a number of independent institutions in Canada that have also said that it was absolutely feasible. The editorial of the Globe and Mail 2 days ago said, you know what, it can be done. Let's try and do it, and let's work together. I think we have way more chance of achieving it if we work together than if, for political reasons, we decide simply not to try and do this. And I think that a lot of the viewers who are seeing this understand that, especially after the summer we're going through in Canada right now with the forest fires, floodings, again in Ottawa today, I've seen images of what's happening there. We have to act to fight climate change. It's costing Canadians billions of dollars in economic impact. It's costing Canadian lives. Like, climate impacts are real. Climate change is real, and we need to act. And that's exactly what our government is proposing that we do in a very reasonable manner and in a very flexible manner.
We certainly know how strongly you feel on this issue. I'm wondering how comfortable you were personally agreeing in this document, in these regulations, to allow, as you say, some natural gas, some diesel, some carbon emitting generation on the grid well beyond 2035. How comfortable were you with that personally?
Very comfortable. Starting in 2021 during the election campaign, we said that we would do that. We would have a net zero grid, a carbon neutral grid by 2035. We never said it would be a fossil fuel free grid. We understand that for certain jurisdiction, it's a bit more of a challenge than for others, which is why we're allowing for those flexibility mechanisms. But it's important to understand that between 2035 and 2050, those regulations will allow to reduce carbon pollution by more than 340 million tons. That's massive. That's what Canada has to do by 2030 to achieve our Paris targets. And that's just in the electricity sector. So this is a very important measure to help Canada do its part to fight climate change. Obviously, climate change is a global issue, and we need to work globally to do that. But I can't go and sit down in front of countries like China or India or others of our peers and say, hey, you need to act to fight climate change if we're not willing to do it here in Canada. And that's exactly what we're doing. And frankly, those regulations that I announced today are very similar to the ones that the United States presented just a few months ago. We're very aligned with our other G7 partners who are all wanting to have a net zero grid by 2035. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned that environmental groups, which you've heard from thus far, are positive about what they've heard, but not uniformly. The Environmental Defense issued a statement, again, in response to what was revealed today, saying these regulations as currently drafted will not deliver on the promise of a net zero grid by 2035. And they list a number of concerns, one of which is the time frame you mentioned, no enforcement of the standards for those next 12 years. But they're also concerned about that time frame you mentioned of allowing some fossil-fired units to be commissioned up until the end of next year and not phased out for another 20 years beyond that. So that could see, again, some carbon emissions on until the early 2040s, theoretically. How do you plan to address concerns like those?
I don't know if you have their press release in front of you, but I read it. And in the first paragraph, what they say is that they applaud the federal government for presenting these regulations today, and that these regulations will play a significant role in helping Canada achieve our climate change target. And of course, they have issues, which is why we're doing consultations. These are draft regulations. We will be consulting with environmental organizations, with provinces and territories, Indigenous nations, as well as public and private utilities and experts to see where we need to tweak those regulations. So I think in a democracy, it's absolutely fine that these groups would say, well, we would do this differently, we would do that differently, and we will be listening to stakeholders in the coming months. But again, if you look at the first paragraph of their press release, they applauded us for what we presented today.
I did read that and then read further to that line, which I mentioned to you, or read it in its entirety. So as you say, the period of consultation for tweaks, 75 days, as is the norm. What is your thinking on how closely the final regulations, the resemblance they will bear to the document we have today?
I would like to think that we came pretty close to finding the right balance, but the idea of presenting draft regulations is that so we can hear people's views and see if we need to adjust, where we need to adjust, and that's exactly what we will be doing in the coming months.
Minister Steven Guilbeault, I appreciate very much the time today. Thank you for being on the program.